Hello and welcome to this Eversheds Sutherland podcast, The Corbynista Revolution. This is the first in a short series of podcasts on the state of the nation and the politics of the world and their interrelation with the UK real estate market. My name is Caroline Andresia. I am a professional support lawyer to the Eversheds Sutherland Real Estate Practice Group, and I'm here today with our speaker, Bruce Deere. Bruce is a partner and head of London Real Estate with extensive real estate experience, which has earned him the honour of being this year's Real Estate Lawyer of the Year and a place in the Real Estate Lawyer Hall of Fame. But in addition, Bruce is our blue sky thinker, our political analyst, our voice of experience, and so ideally placed to take on today's topic of the Corbynista Revolution. So Bruce, can you first perhaps give us some background to the man that is Jeremy Corbyn?
Yes, thank you, Caroline. Jeremy Corbyn has deep roots in the hard left of the Labour Party. He's a sometime columnist for the Morning Star. He was a radical trade union organiser, and he was one of Tony Benn's close band of followers throughout the late 70s and 1980s. Tony Benn, the great charismatic and inspirational figure of the Labour left at that time. Corbyn has been the MP for Islington North since 1983. And during that time he has continued to campaign for a range of left-wing causes, and he is profoundly anti-imperialist. It's sometimes said he knows more about Venezuela than the UK, and he is committed to opposing all forms of imperialism around the world, be they US or British as he sees it. He's sometimes known as the Foreign Secretary of the Left. Were he to become Prime Minister, he would set the tone of the government and its outward relations with countries around the world, but it would be his colleague and Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell who would lead on the detailed policy implementation of that government. And John McDonnell is altogether a more muscular Marxist. He's an intellectual, he's deeply read in Marx and other economists of the left and left-wing theorists like Gramsci, and he came up really through the municipal route, the municipal radical socialist route. You can see him there standing next to Ken Livingstone during John McDonnell's time as finance director of the GLC, when he led opposition to Mrs. Thatcher's rate capping and ultimate closure of the GLC. So together they make a formidable team. Jeremy Corbyn, the warm campaigner, and John McDonnell, the formidable organiser and intellectual.
So Bruce, it's called the Corbynista Revolution rather than evolution. Just how revolutionary would the Labour plans be?
Yes, well, make no mistake, Caroline, this is a revolution that is proposed by both McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn. They want to create a socialist society. McDonnell is on record as saying that he wants to overturn the capitalist society and replace it with a socialist society, which he would see as fairer, more democratic and more equal than the one we've got now. Both McDonnell and Corbyn are long-standing Bennite socialists, which means that they believe that wealth is in the wrong hands in this country and that it is in too few hands. They believe that British workers are exploited and the value that they create is taken away from the owners of capital. And they also believe that international capitalist organisations such as the EU, which is how they see it, they see the EU as a bosses club, help in this oppression of British workers. The other issue they see with British society, the massive issue they see with British society, is that for the last 40 years it has been living under the yoke of the Thatcherite consensus. That is a low tax, small state agenda. And they want to completely smash that consensus and start again. They want to attack inequality. They want to bring in mass council house building. And they want to give a bigger and more involved role for the state, creating social services to make our country fairer and more equal, and of course raising taxes to make sure that happens. Perhaps their approach is best summed up by a phrase which McDonnell repeats over and over again. It originally came from the 1974 Labour manifesto, but the difference between that manifesto and McDonnell and Corbyn is that they really mean this. They want, says McDonnell, to bring about an irreversible shift in wealth and power from the rich and the big corporations to the poor and the workers. And if you keep that phrase in mind, you will have a good working guide to all of their policies, and you will be able to tell more or less where they will stand on any one issue.
So if this reflects their Labour mantra of for the many, not the few, do their attitudes ring true with the voters? How widespread do you think there would be public support for these radical proposals?
Yes, well, Caroline, it's difficult to say because, of course, polls over recent years have been notoriously inaccurate, and the results of elections of all types, and referendums for that matter, profoundly unpredictable. However, there is some sign that Labour's policies do have a degree of popularity in the country. The first sign of that, of course, is at the last general election. They achieved a 40% vote share and they got over 12.5 million votes. In any other general election since the war, that level of support would have been enough for them to secure a victory. So but of course they lost narrowly because Theresa May did increase the percentage of the Conservative vote to 42%, which was one of the highest the Conservative Party has ever scored, something that's often forgotten now that Theresa May has resigned. There's definitely a bedrock of popularity there. It could be seen clearly in that election. And I think it can be seen very clearly in the survey, which is a December 2018 survey undertaken by YouGov. And you'll see there that UK voters were asked, are you in favour of the things that are listed down the left-hand side of that slide, which are, in essence, some of the chief Labour policies? Are you in favour of rent caps to match inflation, for example? Yes, said 74%. Are you in favour of utilities being nationalised? Yes, said 57% of those surveyed. The really interesting one, I think, is at the bottom, because people were asked if they were in favour of raising income tax for those on over £80,000 a year. Now, I'm a relatively old man, and I remember the 1980s, and if you'd asked people during that period were they in favour of this, you'd have got a very different result. But are you in favour of raising income tax for those on over £80,000 a year? Yes, said 65% of those surveyed. And importantly, yes, said over 50% of Conservative voters who were asked. So it strikes me that there is not an appetite out there, particularly for tax cuts, particularly for the higher paid, but there is some considerable appetite for raising taxes for the higher paid. And all of that survey and the results of that 2017 general election bear out something that Tony Benn said just before he died in 2011. He said, don't think we are just an isolated little group. We are not alone. Now, as a matter of fact, when Tony Benn said that, they probably were an isolated little group. But events of recent years, the referendum, the unfolding problems since the great financial crisis, mean that now I think there is a bedrock of support out there, and Labour is a realistic competitor in any general election coming up this autumn or the spring, which now seems very likely indeed.
So if Labour were to get into government in the election perhaps of this autumn or next spring, what would this revolution look like as a legislative agenda? How would it be achieved?
Well, the truth is, Caroline, that it would be the most profound revolutionary legislative agenda since the 1945 Labour government. Labour have said quite openly, Laura Pidcock, for example, one of their front bench spokespeople, has said that she's done with gradualism. She's done with piecemeal. They're going to do it all at once in a profound, irreversible shift. So let's take some examples of the policies on slide 4 there. And it's important to remember that as you consider each of these policies alone, they may not appear to some people to be so radical. But when you consider them in the round as a whole legislative programme, they are a hugely revolutionary programme which will turn capitalist society upside down and, depending on the point of view you take, cause some difficulties and potential chaos in some markets, or will make our society fairer, more democratic and more equal. And you need to take your own political decision on that. But let's look in detail at the individual policies. So Labour are currently proposing that companies which have over 250 employees, and there are over 7,000 of these companies in the UK, will be subject to inclusive ownership funds. And what that will mean is that the Labour government each year will force those companies to transfer 1% of their shareholding into an inclusive ownership fund for workers. Those shares, as far as we can tell, because this is still a working proposal, will carry both voting rights and dividend return rights. Each year for 10 years, Labour will make that company do that until 10% of its shareholding is in an inclusive ownership fund. And the dividends from that fund will be distributed as follows. £500, or dividends of up to £500 for each of the workers in the company, will be handed out. Once the £500 limit is reached, the rest of the returns from that fund of shares will be taken by the government effectively as a tax and spent on Labour's social and political policy priorities. Now, this is a very, very radical policy indeed, because it will involve some dilution, obviously, of shareholder value. It may cause investors, international investors, to think twice before investing in UK companies, and it may lead to some structuring responses from UK business. For example, you might get a sudden burst of companies with 249 employees. Moving on then from appropriation of company shares, there's another much more famous a much larger scheme for public appropriation, and that's the Nationalisation programme that Labour are proposing. And it's important to remember here that both McDonnell and Corbyn, as good Bennites, do not think that the nationalisations of 1945 were well done. They think that they were done top down. They think they were bureaucratic. Even Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister at the time, admitted that what they'd basically done was just change the boards of those companies, same bosses, different hats, he said, and otherwise left the administrative structure of the companies unchanged. The Bennites do not think that was the right way to do it, so they want to do this again. They want to do it from the bottom up. They want to bring in more worker democracy. They want to involve workers on boards. And so, for example, if you take the water companies, they want to privatise the water companies and then break them up so that each water company is a local nationalised body with trade union representatives, local authority representatives and other local stakeholders on its board. So this is a radical democratising reform to these businesses as well as a pure nationalisation. The other question, of course, which has received huge coverage in the newspapers recently, is exactly how much compensation will Labour pay to the shareholders. Most likely they will give government bonds in return for shares in the same way that the Attlee government did. The difference is that the Attlee government actually compensated shareholders royally and extremely generously. One of the reasons why the nationalisations were able to go through quite smoothly in that period. Labour have been talking about perhaps paying book rather than market value, and perhaps applying discounts for the conduct of companies, how they've handled their pension funds, for example, and how they've behaved in relation to climate change. So that is a burning bright political hot potato, the amount of compensation that would be paid. And we watch that with extreme interest. A third policy, very similar to the other two, actually, because it's to do with actually nationalising a major resource and making it work for the public benefit as Labour see it, is Labour's proposal to compulsorily acquire house builder and institutional land banks. Now, this sounds like an extraordinary revolutionary measure, but it has in fact been done before. It was done after the Second World War and again in the early 1950s to create new towns and to create some of the social housing that was needed at the time. The difference here is I think the scale upon which Labour are proposing to do this. If you think about some of the big institutional and house builder land banks, they are enormous. And what Labour is proposing is that they would approach, let's say, a major house builder, and they would say, that's a very large and nice house bank you've got, land bank you've got there. We, along with the local authority here, are going to buy a large portion of that land bank from you, and we're going to build council housing on it. And importantly, we're not going to pay you the price that land would realise if it had residential planning permission. We're going to pay you the price that it would bring if it only had agricultural existing use value applied to it. Now that's a huge discount and would certainly be something which I think the landholders would oppose and be very concerned about, but that is Labour's current proposal. I think it's important to say that each of these proposals at the moment are proposed policies only. They will only become finalised, definite policies once they make their way into the Labour manifesto, and as I understand it, the initial stages of putting together that Labour manifesto are now underway. In keeping with Labour's proposal to democratise the British system, they are looking to bring in measures which would mean that residents in all proposed regeneration schemes would get a right to vote. And here I think it's important to understand where Labour are coming from in relation to regeneration schemes, because they believe that many regeneration schemes that have been undertaken in this country are not genuine regeneration schemes, but they are schemes whereby poor people are cleared out of areas and those areas are then turned into expensive flats with wonderful shops and hipster beard parlours and so on. So they see that almost more as a kind of social cleansing rather than a regeneration project. It may sound extreme, but that's certainly an ideology that currently they find persuasive. So in order to counteract that, they want to bring in a system whereby all residents in, let's say, a major council estate in central London, all those residents would be able to vote on whether or not the regeneration scheme could go through. And if the regeneration scheme did go through, they would have the right to stay in residence. But Labour that's really the platform of Labour's democratisation and transfer of wealth, and particularly their land. But Labour will go further than this, because every year the government and local authorities award about £200 billion of public contracts. And what Labour are saying is that unless you, as a business, reflect their values, you will either not be allowed to tender for those contracts or you won't win them. So, for example, you will have to make sure that you give universal trade union recognition. And there's a whole list of things that Labour would like people to do, some of them very sensible, for example, having gender and race equality policies, or making sure people pay their suppliers within 30 days. Some of them, I think, a little bit more difficult for business to accommodate, such as the CEO rule, which I think will cause boardrooms to feel uncomfortable up and down the land. Labour are saying that if you want to tender and win a public contract, then your CEO must be paid no more than 20 times what the lowest paid employee is paid in your organisation. if you are in the position of breaching that 20-to-1 rule, then you will not win public contracts under Labour unless you can show you're taking genuine steps to solve it. So this is a hugely radical revolution.
With these revolutionary policy proposals in mind, then what can companies and organisations do to prepare for the possibility of a Labour-led government? What should we be doing now?
Well, Caroline, I think that business has now finally woken up to the fact that Labour is a potential government. For a long time, people tried to ignore it and say that these were just a kind of Betamax rerun of 1970s Labour governments and it would never work. That was never really an adequate intellectual response to this policy challenge by Labour. So I think people should be lobbying and engaging with the Labour Party, discussing these policies, accepting where they're sensible and where the objectives are just and fair. So it's obvious, for example, that inequality in this country, particularly asset inequality, needs to be addressed. The question is surely rather how we address it rather than if we address it. So I think lobby and engage and help Labour to adjust these policies in ways that make sense both for the country and for business, because all successful countries, of course, are ultimately founded on the success of business and the economy, and I think that's a message that needs to be driven home with all the parties in our politics. But if engagement doesn't work and Labour come to power, then there are various defences that one can look at, and indeed laws with which Labour will have to apply, which they will do, as they implement these policies. So, for example, the Human Rights Act contains rights to private property, rights to a fair hearing, rights to proper compensation. And as well as the Human Rights Act, the UK is the signatory to a number of bilateral investment treaties, I think more than 70, with various jurisdictions around the world. And these treaties, again, guarantee the property or the assets of those that invest in the UK from abroad, and again give the British government's undertaking that those assets will not be appropriated without proper market compensation and a proper fair hearing and proof really that it's in the public interest to do so. The very important thing about bilateral investment treaties is that if there is any dispute with a future government, be it Labour or otherwise, then that dispute under most bilateral investment treaties is not settled in the UK courts, it's settled in front of an international arbitration tribunal, the details of which will be set out in each of the bilateral investment treaties. So this means that inward investors into the UK from foreign jurisdictions will in many cases be in a better position than British companies to contest or question laws which involve the appropriation of shares, land or other property. So bilateral investment treaties, I think, offer some interesting possibilities, and Labour will have to take careful account of them as they bring in these new laws. I'm not going to go into much detail on free trade agreements and the WTO rules. Suffice it to say that there are some protections within them, by and large weaker than the Human Rights Act and bilateral investment treaties, but they are there. So I think companies need to carefully consider their legal position and how they respond to Labour, both now and in the future should Labour come into power. And I think the other important thing is to just give your business a kind of health check, if you like, a kind of Corbyn audit, so that you can see how many, for example, of Labour's requirements in relation to public tendering you will and can comply with. And to the extent that they make good business sense for you to do so, then you should begin to comply with them now and, as it were, get fit to tender and to compete under a Labour government.
And perhaps rather than looking defensively, what would the opportunities be with a Labour government? What opportunities would their changes bring for companies?
So I think the key thing here, Caroline, is that before every Labour government, really since the Second World War, there's been a great deal of fuss and panic about large-scale capital flight and about market chaos. And by and large, that has not actually occurred when Labour governments have got in. I think it's only fair to say that. That's not to say it might not happen this time, but it is a prediction that's been made many times in the past and not come to fruition. So looking on the positive side, I think Labour are, as part of their revolutionary change for our society, they are looking to completely bring about a huge investment in UK infrastructure, in UK housing of all tenures, but particularly council and social housing, and in new businesses. They're also looking very much to shift the investment focus in the UK away from London and into the regions. So they're talking about setting up regional investment banks to try to revivify the UK regions, for example. They want to hugely widen the sources of finance for social housing, and here I think they would be very interested in working with UK institutions and patient capital of all types. They've said very clearly that they want to encourage long-term investors such as pension funds to stand alongside them and work with them on a joint venture basis in some of the major infrastructure, both soft and hard infrastructure, by which I mean housing as well as rail and ports and airports, that they want to bring about. They're also promising to encourage the off-site production of new modular houses. I think the UK is well behind a number of jurisdictions in using modular, that's basically factory manufactured houses, to address its housing crisis. Some factories in Japan, for example, can knock out 7,000 flats a week. So with the proper application of modular housing and council housing, I believe that the UK housing crisis could be addressed, and that is something that Labour want to look at very closely. So those inventive companies and institutions who've already invested in modular housing may be well placed to get involved in that. And my other point is, if you look at the 2017 Labour manifesto, it has an quite enormously long list of infrastructure projects from Durham to Brighton and back again. And here, Labour will need private capital from institutions and others to make those plans a reality. As I've already said as well, there will be opportunities if you reshape your business properly to make it fit for procurement under Labour, to perhaps give yourself a competitive advantage and to win more contracts than you have hitherto, even if you restructure properly. Overall, we stand, I think, at a crucial moment in British history, perhaps the most important peacetime moment since the Second World War. When I was young in the 1970s, the ideological war between Bennites like McDonnell and Corbyn, who were already very active then, and Thatcherites began. And it was a battle between big and small state, high and low taxation, tight and loose regulation. And that battle has gone on in a low-key way since then, but really the Thatcherite consensus triumphed in the early 90s and has held sway ever since. But now, I think for the first time, we actually have a Labour Party that is controlled by and led by Bennite socialists, and a Boris Johnson cabinet which I think arguably has more Thatcherites in it than any of Mrs Thatcher's cabinets. So we're about to see a showdown between the neo-Thatcherites of the Boris Johnson government and the long-term Bennites of the Corbynite opposition. So it's not so much winter is coming as the election is coming, and it is going to be perhaps the last battle in this 45-year ideological war.
Thank you very much for joining us on this Corbynista Revolution podcast. Contact details are on the screen, and we would be delighted to hear from you with any questions or comments you might have.